Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, if you have a hubcap, go ahead and remove all of your little covers and then your 19mm lug nuts. Now that we have the wheel off, we have a nice clear view of our brakes. We're just going to go ahead and spray down the rotor with some penetrant to help relieve it from the wheel bearing. Now we can let that sit and let's move along to the caliper itself. Now for the caliper, what we need to do is we need to push in the piston. The piston is located inside of here, and it basically goes inside of this area. To do this, I'm just going to use a small pry bar. We'll carefully get in between the caliper and the rotor itself and gently start pulling it in this direction. That'll push in the piston. When you do this, it's a good idea to do it slowly. There we are. Now we can move along to our two 14mm headed caliper slider bolts. Let's remove the pair. Now we can remove the caliper from the vehicle. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to this area along here. This is your caliper boot. You want to make sure you don't see any fluid coming out of here, and you also want to make sure you don't see any tears. Either way, if you saw fluid or a tear, you're going to have to go ahead and replace the caliper. Assuming it looks good, let's continue on by hanging it so it's putting no pressure on our rubber flex hose. Now it's going to be time to remove the pads from the caliper bracket. We'll continue with our small pry bar and carefully pry these out. Typically, I like to give them a good inspection just to see if it looks like they're wearing oddly. At this point, we can continue on to our two 15mm headed bolts that hold the caliper bracket to the knuckle. I'm going to leave this one in here a couple threads, fully remove the second. Remove your bracket. We'll give this a quick inspection. We're going to have a closer look in a minute. Go ahead and set this aside. Now it's going to be time to get the rotor off of here. If yours is rusted in position like ours is, just continue on with one of your original lug nuts. We're going to put it on one of these studs a few good threads, making sure that it's still nice and loose. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and get the rotor off of here. If yours is rusted like ours is, you're going to have to use a hammer. But if you're going to be reusing the rotor, make sure you don't hit on the braking surface. I'm going to be replacing my brakes anyway. Remove your rotor. Now that we have the brakes off of there, let's go ahead and remove this 30mm axle nut. Behind there, there's going to be a washer. Go ahead and remove that as well. Just use a magnet to get this off of here. Now let's continue on with a hammer and a punch. We're going to come right in the center here and break this free. Now that we have the axle broken free, let's move up here. Now what we want to do is go ahead and remove both of these 18mm headed nuts that hold these bolts in. Once you remove the nuts, you can go ahead and drive these right out of here. They shouldn't want to spin. They're essentially kind of pressed in there. Once you have both the nuts off of there, just go ahead and spray down the area with some penetrant. We're going to let that sit for a little bit. While it's doing its job, let's go ahead and take one of those nuts. I'll put it on here a few good threads. Now I'm going to take an 18mm socket and a short extension. Put this right over the nut. Then we're going to give this a couple loving bonks to try to drive this out. Now, as you can tell looking at this bolt, this area right along here is splined. You want to, of course, give this a quick inspection. Make sure it doesn't look like it's broken or damaged in any way. If it looks like it's weak, you need to go ahead and replace it. Now let's go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other bolt. Let's finish separating this. We're just going to pull the axle right out the backside here. Now let's pay attention to the axle where it connects into the transmission. We're going to have to pop the axle right on out of here. Now with that said, there's going to be transmission fluid inside of your transmission. There's a seal here, and when you pop this out, fluid might come out. Make sure you have a collection bucket under the area. Now let's continue on with a hammer, and we're going to go ahead and knock this axle out of the transmission. Now we can come out here, we'll grab right onto that axle. Pull it out of the transmission. Now at this point, there's one more thing you want to pay attention to. That's this area right here. Now what you're going to notice on our axle is it comes with a female end. This area right here actually pops right off. Sometimes you can grab onto it and pull it off. Other times you have to put it on something and give it a couple loving bonks and drive it off. There we are. Now we'll just give this a quick inspection. And there it is, friends. Before we put our axle back in, let's continue by looking at the seal. That's this area right here. The inner aspect is supposed to be rubber, and it's supposed to be soft and pliable and not damaged in any way. Of course, I'm just going to wipe it down. Give it a quick inspection. Now let's clean up the adapter. The area that you want to pay special attention to is this smooth area right here. That's the area that the seal of your transmission is going to ride. So you want to go ahead and wipe it down. Give it a good inspection and feel it with your fingernail. Make sure you don't feel any funny grooves in there. If you do, you might cause damage to the seal. If it needs to be smoothened out, just go ahead and use some fine sandpaper. We'll wipe this down. Give this an inspection inside this area. This is a snap ring or a locking ring. Once it's inside the transmission, it's actually supposed to hold in place. You want to make sure this doesn't look like it's damaged. It's supposed to be a little expanded past the splines. We'll look at this side. Snap ring, expanded past the splines. Let's put this in the brand new axle. I'm just going to go ahead and slide this down and in. Listen for a click, give it a tug, make sure it's secure. Now we can put this into the transmission. I'm just going to go ahead and slide this right up in there and kind of twist it a little bit until it feels though the splines are lined up with the splines inside the transmission. The next thing you're going to want to do is try to push this axle in. Sometimes you could use a rubber mallet to give it a couple bonks just to get it started. There we are. Now have a peek where the axle meets the transmission. You want to make sure it's almost touching. Once you're sure it's in as far as it can go, grab onto the inner aspect, not the boot, the metal, and try pulling it out of the transmission. All right, at this point, I know that the axle is secured to the transmission, so I can continue on towards the bearing. Let's have a look at the strut, where the knuckle's supposed to sit. It's common to find a whole bunch of corrosion inside this area. That's generally due to moisture making its way in here and causing corrosion on the aluminum. I'm just going to go ahead and use a chisel and knock the majority of this out of here. Let's put some copper never sees on the splines of the axle. Now we can take the axle and we'll put it through the back side of the knuckle and out through the bearing. All right, now as we start bringing this up, we want to be trying to push this towards the strut. While we're doing it, we're being very careful not to damage the axle in any way. You can see the boot kind of almost wants to hit. Be extremely careful. Now let's continue on by cleaning our bolts that hold our knuckle to the strut. Now that we have both of our bolts cleaned and we applied some red thread locker, we can start putting this back together. Now you want to be careful as you do this because what you might happen to notice is that down along this area, the strut sits pretty close to the axle. Just be very careful not to damage that boot. Now what you'll notice is I went ahead and I drove the bolts all the way in, up against the strut, into the knuckle. That's because I want those splines to hold it in position while I continue on with my two 18mm nuts. Now we can start on both of our mounting nuts. Now we can bottom each of these out and we'll torque them to 89 foot-pounds. At this point, I always use some red thread locker on the axle shaft here. Let's put on our washer. Time for the axle nut. Now for this, you just want to go ahead and bottom this out by hand. After that, we'll get this a little closer to the ground and we'll torque it to manufacturer specification. Now I'm going to continue on by torquing this to 155 foot-pounds. I went ahead and I put the bar here to hold this in place while I continue. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and coat the bearing surface with some copper never sees. Now the next thing that you would want to do is go ahead and clean up the inside of the brake rotor, right where that hub's going to sit. As you can tell, our brake rotor is in very poor condition. I'm going to be replacing it anyways. But either way, just go ahead and sand down this area so it's smooth and flat. Let's clean down our rotor braking surface. Go ahead and turn it over, do the exact same thing. Now we can place this on our wheel bearing. It's a good idea to use a lug nut to hold it in place. You're going to want to make sure that you clean your mounting bolts for the caliper bracket and apply a thin amount of red thread locker. After that, we can go ahead and get the bracket into position. Let's slide it right on over the rotor and line up the holes with the knuckle. We'll start in both of these mounting bolts, snug them up, and then we'll torque each of them to 85 foot-pounds. Now we can move along to dealing with the brake pads. Now for the brake pads, you want to make sure that it does have the wear indicator on it. Typically the wear indicator is going to be on the inboard pad on the bottom. So all you want to do is just take a wear indicator and you're going to put it right into the groove. Now we can take that pad and we're going to put it in position into the caliper bracket. Now you're just going to want to make sure that it can move around easily inside here. If you had to force it in or even use a hammer, typically that means that you did not clean up the caliper bracket well enough. Go ahead and put on the outboard pad. The outboard pad will not have a wear indicator. Next, it's going to be time to deal with the caliper itself. Typically, I like to use a nice brass brush, and I'm just going to go ahead and clean this down. I want to make sure that there isn't any rust buildup on this that might cause a braking issue. When you're doing this, you also want to make sure you get the back side of each of these ears. Now we'll continue on with a little bit more high temperature caliper lubricant. The areas that we're going to use this is right along the metallic aspect of the piston here, right in the center. Once you have that well coated, we're going to move along to the backside of each of these ears. All this is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Now we can take the caliper and we're going to put it right on over the brake pads. You also want to make sure that it slides over the pins properly. Now we can put in our caliper slider bolts. Once they're in, go ahead and bottom them out and then torque each of them to 25 foot-pounds. We'll use our 14mm to snug these. Now we can get this lug nut off of here. Now we'll put the wheel back on. Start on all 4 of our 19mm lug nuts, bottom them out, get the wheel safely back down on the ground, and then we'll torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. Of course, if you had a hubcap, go ahead and put that on now. Pay attention to this area on the hubcap. That's the area where your valve stem needs to go. We'll get this lined up, and now we can go ahead and tighten up all of our lug covers. Okay friends, we got our axle installed. If you found that you lost any transmission fluid when you were doing the axle, you need to make sure you make your way under the hood and double check that transmission fluid. Aside from that, take it for a road test, make sure you don't hear any funny noises, and get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thank you for watching.